Recording is starting?
Currently, yes, the recording has now started.
Okay. So welcome everybody that's connected to us virtually through Teams. We are very proud to be starting the third of our virtual seminar series on which we are calling the Undata series, virtual seminar series, centered around outrageous questions. We're very pleased today to be joined by Sanjana Hattotuwa, and he is a special advisor to the ICT for Peace Foundation, long-time advisor in a couple of different roles to UN peacekeeping, in particular the UN system on crisis information management, amongst many things. A wide-ranging thinker, and also in particular had been playing several different roles, of course, in his personal life. Currently, he's reading for his PhD at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies in New Zealand. Previously, and I think currently still, a TED Global Fellow, and had been a long-time contributor to the larger set of conversations and dialogues around the use of technology for purposes of peace and security. So I want to turn it over to you, Sanjana, but just to maybe comment that, so far in our virtual seminar series, which had been a replacement for a workshop which we'd intended to hold at the end of March, 1 month ago. Unbelievably, it seemed like 10 years ago already, but the in-person workshop had meant to really provoke new energy and enthusiasm into a series of conversations around how we use data, how do we use technology in innovative ways to advance the goals of peace and security as the UN is implementing on those goals on behalf of member states. So really grateful that now we can still connect, not in person, unfortunately. Hopefully that will happen in the next year, but we can connect virtually and globally to continue the conversation that we'd started maybe many years ago, hope to bring to a kind of a point a month ago. And now, because we can connect through technology, and I think maybe part of what you're going to talk about is maybe the pros and cons of the current situation as we're experiencing the COVID crisis, and what it means politically and what it means for peace and security dynamics. But again, very grateful that you could join us, and maybe over to you, Sanjana.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the invitation. A quick mic check. Can you hear me? Which means that everybody else can, I hope.
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. So what I thought I'll do in the 1.5 hours that we have is to take you through some of what I've been thinking about, both in terms of my academic and professional life, but also with this strange setup where I am in a country, New Zealand, which seems to be ahead of the curve in fighting against the pandemic dynamics. And I am dealing with family and friends and colleagues who are in Sri Lanka. Are you getting some feedback? Oh, anyway, seems to have gone now. Who are in a very different political, social, and pandemic context. And I'm sure that's very true of many of us, even on this call, where families are scattered, colleagues are scattered. The very nature of this call is unimaginable, I suppose, with this kind of frequency and this kind of participation from around time zones, even as recently as the beginning of the year. So it is a disquieting time for all of us. It's an unsettling time. I wanted to place some frames for further consideration based on the little that I know and what little I've been doing. Some of you familiar with the social sciences would have encountered the term a wicked problem. It doesn't mean it in any biblical or religious sense. It means that it comes from the 1960s. A wicked problem is one that has no easy resolution. And furthermore, every solution or every resolution or every possible or transformation that is actually implemented changes the dynamics of the problem. This is the classic Einsteinian thing where the observation or the interaction with a problem changes the dynamics of it. And we've talked about wicked problems in the past in my academic field, in terms of network theory, in terms of poverty alleviation, climate change, and the plethora of issues I think the UN as an institution is dealing with every single day. You might not call it a wicked problem, but these are wicked problems. However, I think that for the popular imagination, for the billions who inhabit planet Earth, COVID-19, the coronavirus, is their first experienced wicked problem in those definitional parameters. And the problem is that we're still struggling with it. And at the top line, the headlines suggest that even within a country, the United States is a cogent example. There is significant variance in how we tackle it. Leave aside regionally, leave aside globally. There are many things that we don't know about the virus. We don't know much about the virus even to date, several months into it. We're still discovering it. I am in the background to this call running a collaborative, global, connected platform called Folding at Home, which is bringing all of our computing power together to crack the protein code of COVID-19. And so these are many efforts around the world that are trying to address it, but every step that we take to address it seems to open up more challenges as a consequence. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, we had political authorities telling to ingest disinfectant, which is not exactly the most helpful thing to do. But for data scientists and for academics like myself, it is, in terms of dark humor, quite interesting to see a correlation now between what is mentioned in politics and on a political pedestal and the actual intake of these things by the people. We had this with a lot of purported cures for COVID in the past couple of months as well. So just to say that this new vocabulary of flattening the curve and combating the virus really is good at galvanizing attention, but also is, in a sense, quite meaningless. Flattening the curve in New Zealand for me here means something very different to my mother and my sister and my friends and my colleagues back in Sri Lanka, which in turn means something very different to India, depending on the state you're in. Kerala is very different to New Delhi. And Missouri is very different to New York, is very different to California, is very different to Spain, is very different to Italy, is very different to the UK. And New Zealand is very different to Australia as well. So there is a shared vocabulary, but the problem is a wicked one, and the solutions add to the complexity of the problem. And one of the things is that we tend to forget that some of what we are experiencing today, exacerbated by COVID-19, are actually the legacy of issues that you, in particular on the call, have been dealing with for many years, if not decades. It's the raison d'etre of the United Nations architecture, at the end of the day, that finds a new expression, new amplification through the pandemic. And it bears, I think, some mention, and we need to kind of take that on, that the pandemic hasn't created problems that have taken us left field. These are old problems with new manifestations. Not often talked about, but a real problem, and I think the UN Secretary General has also mentioned this, is the significant rise in gender-based violence and domestic abuse as a consequence of the kind of context we now find ourselves in. It's all very well and good, and I'll talk about this a bit more, for Hollywood celebrities in their pensions to say stay at home, but stay at home means painful consequences for millions globally. So seclusion exacerbates exclusion on a personal, communal, gender, identity, religious, social, and economic level as well. I'm concerned, and we can talk about this, that the vulnerability today in terms of the sheer devastation to global, local, and regional economies is going to result in violence very, very quickly that goes beyond the digital to the physical and the kinetic. We've seen this in certain countries already in terms of the riots on the ground for people just clamoring for essential services and essential goods out of starvation, and that can be what is globally more prevalent in the weeks and months to come. It's really strange. We've been talking about the digital divide, but right now, the luxury that we have on this call, my son, for example, is doing his schooling over Microsoft Teams. We take these things for granted, but millions don't and cannot get access to what we enjoy right now on this call. And while that might have not been a problem to the degree that it is today, a couple of weeks or months ago, right now it is an existential crisis. Sometimes the mediation of essential services, the difference between getting something and not getting something that keeps you alive is your digital literacy, is your access to a smartphone, is the ability to register with a service that the government provides, thinking in a purely technocratic way that everybody can sign up to it. My mother, for example, can't get access to WhatsApp, not because she doesn't have a smartphone, but because she doesn't have the literacy to do so. So there is an existential crisis, a consequence of the digital divide. There are all manner, and we'll talk about this a bit more, of the governments and authoritarian leaders and populists trying to get into our lives, our bodies, our devices, our computers, our histories, our personal proclivities, simply because there's now an existential concern that overwhelms what would have been or could have been legislative, judicial, personal, and civil society pushback against the erosion of privacy. I see in my country, Sri Lanka, as in many other parts of the world, including, may I say, in the United States. So this is not to suggest that this is, to use old terminology, a problem of the third world or the global south or countries like Sri Lanka. It's very, very much a very real threat in the global north as well. We can talk about that a bit more. The pandemic seems to have accelerated and compressed in time what were authoritarian tendencies that predated COVID-19. I'm very concerned about the privatization of essential services. Bezos is making billions, but is that a cogent solution moving forward? Is Amazon going to be the USPS of tomorrow? I am concerned. I have no solution to it, but I see that as a solution that has inherent dangers. And I'm also, and this is the domain of my doctoral research, we are celebrating today what social media are doing writ large to combat misinfo and disinfo. But there are concerns around what they are doing today around the pandemic, leading to policies, practices, and ways of working and ways of thinking that then migrate or transform or morph into the more broader spectrum of decision-making around platform curation into the future, particularly around politics, political violence, human rights abuse, toxicity, and terrorism on these platforms. I did mention the disconnect between the Instagram world and the ground realities elsewhere. The photo with the crowd is Delhi, soon after Prime Minister Modi, in the matter of a few hours, for a country of over 1 billion people, announced a lockdown. Now, for those of you on this call, this is well known, it is well documented in what it created as panic on the ground as a consequence of what was ordered by the Prime Minister. And I stress this is in a matter of a few hours. And then you have, around the same time, Hollywood actors and actresses with the hashtag #WeAreOne, tone deafness in terms of both the video, but if any one of you were unfortunate enough to see the video, and I must discourage it if you haven't, it is tone deafness also in the sense that none of these people can sing, really. I can sing in the shower better than any one of these individuals, but they sang nevertheless. They ruined the memory of a wonderful song. And as you can see, at the time the screenshot was taken, around 1.6 million people have viewed it, but to broad global ridicule, because the sheer disconnect of what was, with good intention and good faith, produced and promoted by these individuals in very, very different contexts, and projecting that onto the kind of context that you found in India. And I just bring this up because it is violent. There is a degree of violence in the disconnect, in the projection and promotion of creature comforts from wherever you are sheltered at home in the United States, particularly for this demographic segment, and the inability to understand ground realities. And I think that this has come to the fore with COVID-19. Again, this is for PKO staff and for UN staff, I suppose, not something that is entirely new, but it is really quite disturbing to see the ongoing disconnect between both the political and the privileged and the elite levels of society across the country, across the world, across regions, and ground realities, which are really quite horrible. I also want to kind of place on record what I'm seeing in my country as a harbinger of what we might in a dystopian future come to believe and expect. So there is the official narrative of a country with strong leadership dealing with a pandemic such like none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. And so the official narrative is one of success, is one of bravery, is one of courage under fire, is one of taking tough decisions to deal with what's happening on the ground. But to use the UN terminology, the country itself is a harbinger. It's almost what may be the ground conditions and context of many other countries on the ground. Now, I'm putting this slide so that you can take it in. This is the consequence of 2 weeks, or maybe just over 2 weeks, of concerted study into social media in the country, as well as everything that I'm plugged into both the political domain as well as the civil society domain, through colleagues and through data that I ingest as a consequence of my doctoral research. I look at a lot. My doctoral research sits at the intersection of big data and political communications and political violence. So I need to look at this, despite the fact that it's not very pleasant to study it. And everything suggests that the pandemic is a wonderful opportunity for underlying, deeper-rooted, authoritarian, populist strands and strains that predated COVID-19 to be accelerated, entrenched, cemented, and expanded as a consequence of the pandemic, with very little, at best, public pushback, civil society oversight, and judicial review. And it's extremely disturbing. I won't go too much into the details of Sri Lanka because it is esoteric, perhaps, for those of you on this call, but it is not esoteric insofar as this is a lot of what we are seeing from Orbán, from Europe, from even political authorities and political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Leave aside the kind of things that you see out of Russia and the Philippines and elsewhere. And this is disturbing. The long shadow of COVID-19 is going to change the world of politics as we know it. And I don't know which way it's going to go, but it's something institutionally and as citizens, I suppose, we need to take cognizance of and prepare for. A lot of it, at least from the way I see it, the way I would like to kind of direct this call, is pegged to what is called, or this body of research, a body of theory called media effects. And puts very simply, it is to suggest that we are what we consume. And in a sense, for you in the United States or wherever else you are dialing in from, for me in New Zealand and for my colleagues and family in Sri Lanka, it's extraordinary for one reason. We are right now living and inhabiting a world where the kinetic and the physical face-to-face interactions, be it at office or around coffee or around the water cooler or in bathrooms or loos or public transport, it's simply not there. and everything that we consume and is mediated in terms of our perceptions of the world is over digital, online, or social media. And that brings us to the attention economy that many have talked about, but it's really quite extraordinary a time that we're living in, because it's going to be studied not just by the social media companies, but by academics for years to come as to what it actually resulted in as a consequence of consuming so much purely digitally and only over social media, how that translated into our physical and kinetic engagement with the world. Now, this is a graph that I only present to highlight two things. In Sri Lanka, the likes of, I don't know, E-Entertainment or Tatler or tabloid yellow journalism, but what I would, for the purposes of my study, call gossip pages. They are in my language, Sinhalese. And what many don't realize is that they are the drivers of news and information in the country, not professional journalism, not mainstream journalism. And if you take a look at the kind of volume of content that is produced every single day, they are the drivers of our understanding of society, politics, and the pandemic and COVID-19. So that's a whole presentation in and of itself. But what I want to suggest to you is that it's really interesting, because for the first time, when I studied this, so nobody's ever done this before in Sri Lanka, what I discovered, and that's the chart that you have there, the darker blue areas, both at the top of the hour, so the numbers at the top represent the top of the hour, and the numbers going down represent the minute. So on the hour, every hour, from about 10 to 6 every day over March, and half past the hour from about, again, 10 to 8 every day over March, that blue segment pushed out an inordinate amount of content. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that this is not organic. It's engineered, it's coordinated, it's collaborative, it's structured, it's architected, and it's intentional. And again, it's another presentation altogether as to who is doing this and why, but it is merely to put and place on record that our social media landscapes are architected and instrumentalized and weaponized and crafted and created by powers and actors and groups and coalitions and institutions that we as consumers don't often see. So the enemy is often Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, when in effect, it could be other more local actors gaming the platforms. And the problem with that in the pandemic time is that what you see is actually very low quality news and information. And this is really hard for people to grasp, because I think those of us who have grown up with censorship, as I have, people who have experienced censorship in the time of in the USSR or the former Soviet Republic or countries which have had authoritarian leaders, associate censorship with the paucity of information, the violent erasure of it, torture, the silencing of journalists, the murder of journalists, the burning of printing presses, and the blocking or banning of websites. When today, and this is very well studied, it's the glut, it's the tsunami, it's the engineered abundance that is the problem. And so when a lot of people agree, it's actually not because the whole population is agreeing, but it appears to be the case that you have a critical mass, and that is manufactured. And this has a consequence in pandemics, because it is used to prop authoritarianism and populism, promote snake oil treatments, prop up individuals and parties and actors and institutions, and in my case, in my country, the military, that is polar opposite to or inimical to democratic governance and parliamentary oversight. So the information deluge is a systemic problem. And this is contradistinct to the challenges and a lot of the discussion around disinformation that we find in Western media. Garry Kasparov, for example, the chess grandmaster, said in, I think, December 2016, that the problem of modern propaganda is not that it tries to censor, but that it tries to annihilate your critical thinking by this tsunami of content. And that is exactly what we are seeing in the world today. And that's a problem for democracy. And if democracy is the raison d'etre, or is what the United Nations system and architecture and institutionally you are anchored to, we have a problem. And that's going to be exacerbated and roll out in, as I said, the long shadow of the pandemic. Because what is happening today with the manipulation of media in ways that many are not studying, but is evident if you know where to look and how to look at it, is going to determine the imagination, the perceptional landscape, the space, the socio-political space that you and I will operate in, whatever that we do in the months and weeks to come. Now, it's a challenge for social media companies as well, because they never had a time like this. So a lot of SM companies in Silicon Valley are now working from home because of shelter-in-place regulations. And globally, it's all work from home. Many of you may not know that they didn't plan for this. So one of the consequences of this is that content moderation, for example, might be slightly better now, but moved to completely algorithmic and automated review because the curators and the content moderators couldn't access the network infrastructure from their home systems because of security and other issues. So the human aspect and element of it went out the window. And that has implications. So again, this is from my research and from my tweets and a document on Google Docs that I maintain in the public domain around a lot of what I see in Sri Lanka. And something that I warned early on is that because these SM companies have so much of power to shape our public imagination and are so integral and inextricably entwined in the pandemic response, the shift to automated review and algorithmic oversight is going to have significant implications on markets like Sri Lanka and Myanmar. And I don't need to tell a UN audience about the problems of Myanmar and Facebook. It is going to exacerbate those markets where these companies have had a legacy of not having too much of attention on and investment around. And what that results in, I think, is already evident, but is going to result in more systemic violence and conflict on the ground as a consequence of these measures. And so in general, writ large, what you see is with the mask of benevolence, the rise of despotism and the rise of structural inequality and inequity. And so what you find in many countries is this language of concern and care, but that benevolence hides a really darker side of discrimination as well, which is now being ingrained even more into systems that the UN, for example, has been privy to and fighting against. I am very concerned in the newfound, what I call the reputational laundromat of the pandemic to change the way we see Silicon Valley. I'm not saying these people are bad people. I'm not saying things done today are bad. But if you recall just a few months ago, the conversation was around the toxicity of the conversation, the toxicity of content, the terrorism, and the violence of these platforms. And today we are looking at them as saviors. I'm very concerned about, put simply, the tension between China and the United States and the implication it has for our AI future. We are already seeing, obviously, greater hostility, which will result in lesser cooperation and the balkanization of the development of AI, which is disturbing on a number of fronts. I'm very concerned about the fact that, for example, I may be able to travel just because I happen to be a Sri Lankan in New Zealand to a greater degree and with greater freedom than Sri Lankans from Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka, where a new elite of those who are immune to get the injection first or are living in countries like New Zealand get the certification that they are fine to work and talk and walk and work and migrate, but that billions of others are not able to do the same thing. So this creation of a new elite who have access to either the pandemic solutions or vaccinations or coming from countries that are dealing with it better versus billions who are hostage to, through no fault of their own, conditions which are very different. I'm very, very concerned about refugees and IDPs and tighter border controls. The border controls that we see today migrating and moving and morphing into tighter border controls that restrict population flows. And this new tide of xenophobia, which I think all of us have seen, which tries to suggest that COVID-19 is something that is imported and not really something present in our geopolitical realities. And again, I've written about this quite extensively around, for the purposes of this call, you could put it as a significant increase in China's presence on social media that is ironically banned in their own country, and this new domain of debt diplomacy, where countries like Sri Lanka are propped up as a consequence of our debt to China and to other debtors as well, and our foreign policy pivots to supporting those regimes as a consequence of also now pandemic aid that then puts us into untenable situations even more into the future. And the final concern that I have is what is called syndromic surveillance. So epidemiological tracing, tracing. Again, the jury's out on this. Germany flip-flopped. America, every state seems to have a different solution. Australia is following Singapore's app development. So the jury's out on this. Apple and Google are now getting into the fray. But to put it to you that the best of surveillance for the pandemic can lead to the worst of outcomes in contexts and countries with a democratic deficit. And Harari Yuval talked about this. The interview with Christina Manpour is in the public domain. Some of you may have seen it. And that other image is a prison from Cuba. And I'm very, very concerned that what is now instantiated for the best of reasons with little to no pushback from the publics in our respective countries. I'm not even saying this is a possibility. I'm saying that this is a very definite risk that is probable in countries like Sri Lanka, where it migrates and translates into wider, deeper, more entrenched pan-citizen surveillance that aids and abets authoritarianism. So what? What do we do now? So this is the disturbing, dark, dystopian future that I'm sure other speakers may have also projected shades of. And I would suggest that we also need to think and take the bull by the horns and start talking about this as UN staff colleagues or myself as an activist / academic with a new vocabulary. We need to shift the way that we think and talk about this. And that is what I would like to devote the next few minutes to. The Greeks had a very interesting sense of time. One is the time that I'm sure Christina or Tyler will remind me of in a bit that I'm running out of. It's the 1.5 hours that we have for this call, after which we go back to life as we know it in wherever that we are. That is Chronos, a linear conception or understanding of time, time that passes. They also had, which is lesser known in the Western Judeo-Christian world, a different notion of time, Kairos. And Kairos is opportunity. It is nostalgia. It is to think about, for example, when a very famous character actor in India, Irfan Khan, died yesterday, to think about my experience of watching him on screen. And one of the last things that I did out of pure nostalgia and a degree of sadness was to watch a film before I slept last night with him on it. Now, he's not connected to me in any way, but I was taken back not just to the film, but to the moments I saw those films around, where I saw it, who I saw it with, what I was feeling when I saw it. And that is a conception of time known as Kairos. And I think that the pandemic is a wonderful Kairos for us to pivot our approach to the way we do things as government, as people, as communities, as neighbors, as colleagues, as individuals, as activists, as academics, as people, really. And I have, at the risk of great violence and probably pushback and things thrown at monitors around the world at me, because you can't throw it at me in person, some suggestions and ideas. These are some things that I've been thinking about, and certainly are not exclusive, and not meant to insult or inflame, but are meant as conversation starters. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about in terms of all our institutions is decentralization. The center does not hold, to quote Eliot's poetry, and if the center cannot hold, then those at the periphery, those at the front lines are the ones that need to be kind of empowered to take the decisions that make a difference today and will make a difference in the future as well. And that needs to be part of the institutional DNA. I think that we talk endlessly till the cows come home about doing this, but I put it down in the second bullet point as less 38th floor and more ground floor. When I've sat at the ground floor of the UN, I see more chaos, more complexity that seems to kind of reduce the further up in the building that I go to this sameness, this commonality, artificially induced, of course, because of seniority and decorum. But it even in the same building in New York, you're disconnected from the ground floor and what's happening and life, as it were, the further higher you go up. And I think that's a good metaphor for institutional reform. Less pensions. I think we need to kind of do away with people who are there because they've always been there. And this proclivity that Christina is a harbinger of and is a wonderful individual for kind of championing within the organization to get young people in, but to get young people in not just because we have young people in and to parade and promote them and to put up a poster saying that we have young people, but to actually give them power. And so kind of create this new kind of way of thinking that doesn't treat young people as a quota that needs to be filled, but as young new ideas as integral to how we go forward. And we need to think about this radically. I think it needs a radical intersectionality. You can't think about peacekeeping today without thinking about development, without thinking about health, without thinking about governance. You can't think about governance without thinking about media landscapes. You can't think about media landscapes without thinking about political personalities. You can't think about politics without thinking about wider, deeper, longer term drivers of conflict, and so on and so forth. And I think that these artificial silos that the UN operates in for a world that doesn't exist anymore needs to be done away with. Mapping and monitoring needs to be far more coherent. And I don't think that we are going back to a normal. When people, I mean, I understand it, and as mothers, as fathers, we all want to go back to a normal as well. But the abnormality of the present is going to be the normalcy of the future. And that's something that we really need to take into account, because we seem to be designing and responding to the situation to go back to what was at the beginning of the year. I don't think that's doable, and I don't think that's desirable. And so deviation is innovation is from a very interesting academic called Trudy Barber, who in 2006, actually writing about sexuality and sexuality's interconnectedness with technology, wrote about how sexuality and how people expressed sex acts and sexuality using the technology of the day created these wonderful ways in which technology also evolved to keep pace with how people were using it. So deviation is a good thing. Deviation from the norm is a good thing. And that's something that the UN could embrace. New voices and values need to, I mean, come on, go, overtake tradition and trepidation just because we haven't done something ever before, and just because it might actually anger our superiors because they don't understand the nature of the problem doesn't mean we should try it, and to be damned as a consequence, but to try nevertheless, and to kind of use networked intelligence more. And this is not just about hardware, but a radical difference in how we connect with each other around the world as colleagues. And this comes now from political science, where we talk about the Overton window, where, and you can read about this a bit more, this is something that Trump does very well. This is something that populists and dictators do very well. They shift the window to what's convenient and useful for them to have a debate around. And they keep doing this. So even when you want to kind of push back against these individuals, you go to where they are at, to their playing field. And right now, and Christina and I talked about this in a prep call for this call, we need to kind of be brave and unapologetic in shifting the terrain and the domain and the window to the world we want to see as it must be, not as it is. And the pun here is obviously with the book about Obama around that was titled The World as It Is. And I would reframe that to kind of suggest that we need to be entirely unapologetic and brave and courageous and voluble and loud about the world as it must be, a just world, a world where the UN and its founding principles are the norm. And we need to stop pussyfooting about it, stop talking about iterations, and just get on with it and get there and project and promote that, because that's then where the debate will be. And the pandemic and COVID-19 is as good an excuse as any. And I don't mean to be cruel, but we are never going to get this opportunity again. So to kind of grab this pandemic by the horns and grasp the opportunity. And I want to kind of put on the table this phenomenon that I think many of us have seen called murmuration. And the way we see it, I mean, we might not be familiar with the word, is when we go to an aquarium or when we go diving or when we go to a field and we see this flock of birds flying in formation, or when we see these fish swimming in formation, there are some really fundamentally difficult qualities that are at play there from the world of physics. And there's an interplay between repulsion, alignment, and attraction. Again, I won't spend too much of time around this, but I'm just going to show you a video. And I would suggest to you that today, the UN and institutions and all of us are the tree line. We are unmoving. We are the ones around which, in our unmoving, inflexible state, the world is morphing and changing in ways that we cannot always immediately understand or respond to. And to understand what is technically called swarm dynamics is both fundamental to understanding the world, but I would say is also fundamental to understanding how we need to re-engineer our institutional response as well, our institutional design, and to kind of change the way we operate, to see change as a constant, not something that is going to go away. As I said, the new normal is not something that we woke up to at the beginning of the year. To see leadership as fluid, it's less about who inhabits the 38th floor. It's less about this hierarchy of floors. The higher you are, the more powerful you are. And it's more about a quality and style, as well as an integral nature of leadership that is fundamentally different to what we have today. And to also recognize the fact that the edges, the people at the front lines, the new recruits are the ones probably who are the most valuable to institutional response. So it is to imagine the swarm and to change our institutions to reflect swarm dynamics as well. And finally, I think I also want to leave you with some specific challenges around my old domain, which is peace building aligned to PKO. And the shift, I think, that is going to be somewhat permanent of this change from what's called IRL, in real life interactions, boots on the ground, feet on the ground, personal on the ground, to URL, which is a more virtual interaction. And these are just some ideas and things that I think we have to take on board. Countries are bankrupt. My country, which is a large troop contributing country, is quite literally bankrupt. So I don't know how we are going to afford to be able to send troops, maybe as we will continue doing it, because that then takes away the burden for several thousand from the government having to pay their salaries, but it is going to have an implication. I'm very concerned about the fact that DPKO and other entities are going to have to go to Silicon Valley to get the data that we want, to get an understanding of the context that we are operational in. I wonder whether countries are going to replace troop sharing with data sharing, whether data sharing agreements at a level that we've never seen before are going to kind of replace or complement the boots on the ground. Then there is the challenge of the fact that just on this call, the difficulty of following me, I might have lag, and there's a lot of psychology studies around the fact that video calls make us far more tired than real face-to-face interaction because of things that our brains are trying to process as a consequence of of the video and the audio not being in sync. We're not consciously aware of it, but our brains are unconsciously trying to process it, and we are tired as a consequence of it. And this is exacerbated by the fact that if you don't have physical access or boots on the ground, the digital is not the terrain. How do we know what's going on just as a consequence of greater, larger, wider, more expensive ingest of just social media proxy data points? Today, I don't know of whether we can talk about PKO without talking about pandemic consequences and the long shadow of COVID-19 and health as a central pillar of both stability and a driving factor of instability and violence, access to health being central to that, and whether, if at all, a virtual presence, digital blue caps can ever replace the kind of institutional architectures and the multi-billion-dollar operation we have as PKO today. These are profoundly important questions that need to be answered in a way we have never actually contemplated even at the beginning of the year. So what should the UN do? Should we do more of the same? Should all of us do more of the same? What is our role, reach, and relevance? I don't know. I have no clear answers to this, but I hope that in the moment that we have, in the Kairos that we experience variously but collectively, that we kind of embrace some of these challenges and discussions to go beyond the dissemination of this video and 100,000 pages that will be written on it in the way that we are used to dealing with this, but to radically reform our answers and the way we kind of answer this global challenge as well. And I have a few ideas. I think that the UN is, for me at least, and colleagues can be impolitic and differ, your internal change is going to shape the world. And let's be blunt and honest about it. And how you project yourselves as an institution post-COVID-19 is going to matter profoundly. Global responses require, I think, global thinking. And this kind of structural vulnerabilities we see only the UN can address, because every country is dealing with it in a contained, controlled, country, community specific way. The UN is dealing with it at a larger level. I think that the UN should be centered forward in driving the discussions around global governance models for social media companies. I think that's a conversation that's parked for the moment. It was coming, it's parked for the moment. It needs to come, and the UN needs to drive it. I like to think of the UN as Lego. I love to play with Lego. I think most of us do, if given half a chance. And I like to think the UN as kind of providing and that's linked to the next idea, which comes from the world of programming, the UN as providing the building blocks for solutions instead of providing us with the institutions through which the solutions are provided. And that's a fundamentally different way of thinking of the UN. I think the austerity, you are already facing a cash crunch. I think it's a good thing. I'm sad for colleagues who are going to go through tough times, but I think that tough times bring out the best ideas, and that austerity can be used as an impetus for radical reform within the institution, that the austerity, without the austerity, would never have come about, and certainly with the pace at which I hope it will come about. And I would go as far as to suggest, and be as bold as to suggest, that you really need to actively defund the status quo. You need to get rid of the old ways of thinking and the people associated with those, and to kind of fund new, innovative, swarm, intelligent, networked, edge-based ways of working and dealing with this issue. And this is the penultimate slide. I'm very, very concerned that we don't seem to think more about, even as we are concerned so much, justifiably, with the existential concerns of COVID-19 and coronavirus, about what's going to come, and investing in what's going to come, because this is not going to be the last thing. Everything from sun flares leading to internet outages, politicians, we know this, as I said at the beginning, we know that what politicians say leads to what people do. And the political authorities that we have in the global north and the global south are very, very dangerous in what they articulate and express, because it has an immediate consequence on the ground. And that may not be the next pandemic, but it could lead to regional and global instability very, very quickly, because if nothing else, the pandemic has shown the fragility of global logistics chains and the fragility of a global economy. So we need to go back to things like climate change and think about the ways in which, and I've listed out a few, these things are going to impact globally how we live regionally and locally. And I think that we really need to think and plan for, even as we're dealing with COVID-19, what's to come in the world to come. My background is in English literature, which is why for those of you who don't have a background in Shakespeare, I have inundated you with Shakespeare's quotes. But I think that this one is as good as any to end with. I think we are very, very good at knowing what we are and what we have done. And there is security in doing things the way we have always done it, to go back to a normal that we understood normal to be at the beginning of this year. I think, though, and I would submit to you that all of that has gone out the window. And instead of the fear and anxiety that brings, which is normal and justified, to take the pandemic by the horns and to be our better selves as well, to reboot ourselves, to be more than what we think we can be today. And I think that's both a personal as well as a shared problem. That's a shared challenge for me, as well as I hope, and I project and I submit, is a shared challenge for all of us on this call and for humanity as we know it. Thank you very much.